I declare the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly resumed and call to order its 53rd plenary meeting. Members will recall that in paragraph 9 of its resolution ES 10/23 of 10th May 2024, the Assembly decided to adjourn the 10th Emergency Special Session temporarily and to authorize the President of the General Assembly at its most recent session to resume its meeting upon request from member states. In this regard, I should like to draw the attention of the delegations to document A/ES 10/1009, which contains a letter dated 9 September 2024 from the permanent representatives of Syria, of the Syrian Arab Republic, Mauritania, and Uganda in their respective capacities as chairs of the Arab Group, the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation Group, and the Coordinating Bureau of the Non-Aligned Movement, requesting the resumption of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly. I intend to conduct the proceedings of this meeting in accordance with the rules of procedure of the General Assembly and the past practices of its emergency special sessions. In accordance with Rule 63 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly, the President and Vice Presidents of the 79th session shall serve in the same capacity at the resumed 10th Emergency Special Session. Turning to the Credentials Committee, may I take it that it is the wish of the General Assembly to decide that the Credentials Committee of the 79th session should serve for the resumed 10th Emergency Special Session. It is so decided. In keeping with established practice, I should now like to invite the attention of the General Assembly to document A/ES 10/1010 concerning member states that are in arrears in the payment of their financial contributions to the United Nations within the terms of Article 19 of the Charter. May I take it that the Assembly duly takes note of the information contained in this document. It is so decided. The General Assembly will now resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5 entitled, and I quote, Illegal Israeli actions in occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, end of quote. In connection with this item, the Assembly has before it a draft resolution issued as document A/ES 10/L 31/revision 1. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, we are meeting today in the context of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the legal consequences of Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The advisory opinion is in pursuance of General Assembly Resolution A/RES/77/247 adopted in this very hall. In the terms of the court, it is incumbent upon the United Nations, particularly this Assembly and the Security Council, to consider the precise modalities and further action required to bring to an end as rapidly as possible the unlawful presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. It is, of course, at the discretion of the General Assembly, where every member state has an equal voice and vote, to decide how to respond. This resumed 10th emergency special session is therefore a moment for reflection and dialogue. It is a moment to find a durable solution to the age-old Palestinian problem. As President of the General Assembly, who has vowed to serve with unyielding dedication to the Charter and the principles of the United Nations, it is, however, my duty to stress that international law, the Charter of the United Nations, and UN resolutions must be respected by all member states. Without prejudging the outcome of this special session, it is our collective duty as representatives of the international community to ensure that the principles of justice and the rule of law prevail. For without justice and the rule of law, Israelis and Palestinians alike will not attain what they long for most: peace and security. In our deliberations, we must not lose sight of the many lives lost, the staggering humanitarian challenges, and infrastructural destruction that continue to take place, particularly in Gaza, in the past several months. I hope our gathering here will make a positive difference in the lives of the many who continue to suffer in this region and who look up to us to make the right decisions at this emergency special session. Thank you. I now give the floor to the observer of the Observer State of Palestine to introduce draft the resolution A/ES10/L31/revision 1.
Mr. President, I congratulate you for the assumptions of the presidency of the 79th session. Mr. President and colleagues, Palestine is an important part of universal history, and the Palestinian people is an integral part of humanity. Neither our country nor our people will disappear. But that is no excuse for ignoring the existential threat they are facing. Palestinians have carved in a reality of suffering and oppression, spaces of joy and accomplishment. Their spirit has remained free, even while they were in shackles. They have preserved hope when everything around them should have led them to despair. They have been true to their identity regardless of the price they had to pay. They have been steadfast in the purest of their inalienable rights, just like all other peoples. Mr. President, the Palestinians want to live, not survive. They want to be safe in their homes. They want their children to go to school without fear. They want to be free in reality as they are in spirit. Free to live, to come and go, free to determine their own fate, subject only to God and to no other. They want to be Palestinians, to be themselves, just be, neither heroes nor victims, just human beings with the simplest of dreams or the greatest of aspirations, living in dignity, in peace and security in their homeland. The Palestinian people is an extraordinary people whose true desire is to lead an ordinary life. Palestinians want to live and thrive on their ancestral land, where the spirit of the forefathers and foremothers embraces them, where the suspended tales of their lives await to be resumed. Palestinians want for children to bury their parents after a long and beautiful life, rather than for parents to bury their children before they could know the meaning of life. Palestinian children do not need to grow through the lessons of terrifying pain. The lessons of life should suffice. Now the sky is full of children whose life was taken away way too soon and in the cruelest of ways. And the earth is full with children who have suffered, who were injured, paralyzed, orphaned, and traumatized. Mr. President, as we speak in these halls, coming together yet again to address this grave, historic injustice, 2 million people are being besieged, bombed, starved. They are being displaced over and over again with no safe haven anywhere, with death awaiting them everywhere. How many more Palestinians need to be killed before change finally takes place to stop this inhumanity? How many more Palestinians need to be violently displaced by the repeated attacks of Israeli settlers and occupation forces? How many more Palestinians need to be snatched in the middle of the night and thrown into an Israeli jail for years and years, childhoods lost, lives ruined? How much more denial of rights, dispossession, and destruction will it take for the world to finally not only react, but act? Until the world not only takes a stance, but takes a stand and firmly acts upon it, truly upholding the rule of law, and human rights. Mr. President, the General Assembly requested from the International Court of Justice its authoritative opinion on the Israeli occupation, and the court upheld its mandate. Allow me to quote the court, and I quote, "The sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the occupied Palestinian territory and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israelis' presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful." Unlawful, end of quotation. If we need to identify two cardinal rules, two pillars on which the international law-based order was built, they would be the right of peoples to self-determination and the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force. And these are the rules that Israel has been breaching openly and brazenly for decades without consequences. The court fulfilled its mandate by unequivocally identifying the legal consequences for Israel. All states and the United Nations, and by placing them before the General Assembly, the Security Council, and all states to take the necessary measures to ensure compliance with international law. This was a historic opinion. Let me repeat. This was a historic opinion, as this was the first time the court examined the Israeli occupation as a whole. Now that the court has answered the request, it is time for the General Assembly to uphold its mandate and for all states to uphold their own obligations to ensure Israel compliance with its own in the face of its blatant non-compliance and relentless breaches. The court's advisory opinion showed that there is no doubt about the facts or the law. But the law is not there to merely serve as a measuring stick of violations. It is there to prevent those violations, and when that does not work, it is there to punish them, to bring them to a halt, to ensure accountability, to ensure justice. Unchecked, undeterred Israeli impunity will only mean more and more Palestinians killed, maimed, detained, more destruction, more loss, more misery. It must be brought to an end. Only then can we expect a genuine change that could lead to peace and to the implementation of the two-state solution. Mr. President, a few voices have claimed that departure from the law or its abandonment was the only realistic way forward. But it is precisely the departure from the law or its breach without any consequence that led us here in the first place. No occupying power can have a veto right over the inalienable rights of the people under its occupation. Let me repeat. No occupying power can have a veto right over the inalienable rights of the people under its occupation. Those who think the Palestinian people will accept a life of servitude, a life of apartheid, are the ones who are not being realistic. Those who imagine the Palestinian people will disappear or surrender are the ones who are not being realistic. Those who claim that peace is possible in our region without a just resolution for the question of Palestine are the ones who are not being realistic. A few voices claim this is not the right time for such action. They always find good reasons to keep doing the wrong thing. But delayed justice is denied justice. The right time to do the right thing is always right now. The right time to do the right thing is always right now. While looking at a map, or worse, looking at the horrific situation on the ground, the matter may look inextricable, but the solution is right before our eyes. It is the one endorsed by the international community as a whole and enshrined in numerous United Nations resolutions. It is an independent and sovereign state of Palestine on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side in peace and security with Israel. So why are we allowing the destruction of the state of Palestine and of this solution when we know there is no viable alternative and we all understand the risk of an all-out conflagration? What is happening in Gaza today can be the last chapter of the tragedy endured by the Palestinian people, or will be the first chapter of an even more tragic reality for our region as a whole. What you do next matters. Act now to stop the killing, to stop the suffering, to stop these crimes, to stop this injustice. Mr. President, I have the honor to introduce the draft resolution under consideration in this emergency special session. This is the first time since we've received additional rights and privileges through resolutions that you have adopted. I am so honored to do that for the first time in the General Assembly. I am so tall, I go beyond the ceiling of this General Assembly. This emergency special session is entitled, and I quote, "Advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences arising from Israelis' policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and from the illegality of Israelis' continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory," end of quotation. As contained in document A/ES-10/L.31/Rev.1. I want to thank more than the 40 countries so far that have co-sponsored the draft resolution. The draft resolution faithfully reflects the advisory opinion of the ICJ, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, and it is grounded in international law and aims at furthering respect for its rule, for the Palestinian people, but for the international community as a whole. We thank all delegations that engaged on this text and have done our utmost to address their concerns while ensuring the text remains aligned with the opinion rendered by the court. The draft resolution in its preambular paragraphs reflects the determinations arrived at by the court, while focusing in its operative paragraphs on the obligations of Israel, all states, and the United Nations and other international organizations in accordance with international law. It also calls for a number of individual and collective actions to uphold the law and implement the relevant United Nations resolutions on the question of Palestine. It seeks action for accountability, the fundamental path for justice in any case, and Palestine cannot be the exception. Mr. President, I stand on this podium at this historic and tragic juncture to tell the Palestinian people that a change is going to come. A change is going to come. That their fate is not endless suffering and agony. That freedom is their bright right and their destiny. I stand on this podium to tell you that justice is the only path to peace. To call on you, to call on all of you to uphold international law, not sacrifice it on the altar of cold and reckless political calculations. I call on you to reject double standards, to treat my people with the respect they deserve, and to recognize the rights they are entitled to. We are not a people too many. We are not a problem. We are a nation that asks for nothing more than your nations, but can accept nothing less. We want to live in freedom and sovereignty and dignity and peace and security in our ancestral land. We are committed to the rule of international law and to justice and lasting peace in our region. This requires ensuring that same rules apply to all. No bias, no double standards, no exceptionalism, and no exception. Each country has a vote, and the world is watching us to see if we can live up to the commitments we undertake and to the principles we claim as ours at this historic and crucial juncture for humankind. Please stand on the right side of history, with international law, with freedom, with peace. The alternative is what you witness every day on your TV screens, and what the Palestinian people are enduring in their flesh. A different reality is possible. It starts now and here. Free Palestine, peace for all, and I thank you.
I thank the observer of the observer state of Palestine. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is my first time speaking here at the General Assembly after the October 7 massacre. 11 months ago, a terrorist army invaded southern Israel. In a single barbaric assault on a Jewish holiday, they murdered over 1,000 of our citizens and carried out the most heinous atrocities in modern history. Hundreds of vibrant young Israelis were murdered while celebrating life at a music festival. Hundreds of innocent people peacefully sleeping in their homes with their families were slaughtered. Some burned alive while holding their loved ones, and hundreds more were taken hostage, dragged into a captivity more brutal than anything anyone could ever imagine. Even now, as we speak, over 100,000 Israelis remain displaced within their own country, unable to return home due to the relentless rocket attacks from Hamas in the south and Hezbollah in the north. Perhaps you have forgotten, but we did not start this war, nor did we choose it. We are fighting a war forced upon us. We are fighting for our homes, our families, our future. We fight because we have no other choice. Yet, despite the cruelties we have faced, despite the unprecedented terror unleashed upon our people, this assembly remains silent. I was certain that the first resolution that would be brought before you all would be the unanimous, unequivocal condemnation of terror, the rape, the torture, the kidnappings that took place on that darkest of days. Yet, there has been no condemnation, no resolutions. Instead, we gather here to watch the Palestinians' UN circus, a circus where evil is righteous, war is peace, murder is justified, and terror is applauded. How dare you continue this tradition of passing one-sided resolutions against Israel without even pausing to consider what the Israeli people have endured? Since October 7, this assembly has passed 2 resolutions on this matter. Yet, there has not been one word about Hamas and barely a word about the hostages. Those who contribute to this circus are not simply bystanders. You are participants, enablers, collaborators. Every vote you cast in support of this circus fuels the violence and emboldens those who reject peace. This empty show is not just an insult to the victims of October 7, an insult to the hostages. It is an insult to the very fabric of this institution. You are not promoting today peace and justice. You are dancing to the tune of your ringmasters, the Palestinian Authority. Look at this picture. Look at it closely. Study it. That blood on the floor belongs to 6 beautiful human beings: Eden, Hirsch, Alex, Carmel, Ori, and Almog. That is their blood. 6 innocent Israelis executed in cold blood after months of suffering in this tiny, dirty tunnel where they couldn't even stand, hidden under a child's bedroom. Imagine that being your child, your spouse, your friend. Imagine them for a moment suffocating, starving, bleeding in a dark hole for months. If it were your child, your loved one, would you sit in silence? Would you pretend this was just another story? Or would you scream for justice? Let me say this clearly. Jewish blood is not cheap. The days when it could be spilled without consequence are over. The days when the Jewish people were at the mercy of tyrants are over. Never again will we stand by while our people are massacred. Never again will we depend on your mercy or your judgment to protect us. Thank God that today we can defend ourselves. Today we have the strength to protect our state. Today we have the resolve to to secure our future. So instead of condemning Hamas's brutal murder of over 1,200 Israelis, innocent men, women, and children, the Assembly sits silently. In place of this most basic common sense action, this circus focuses on distractions. The process that all other countries usually follow has been abandoned. Where are the negotiations, the deliberations? You have allowed the Palestinians to become the ringmasters, and those who vote for this resolution are playing their part. This resolution distorts the flawed advisory opinion of the ICJ. It ignores the truth, twists the facts, and replaces reality with fiction. It ignores completely. I didn't hear Mr. Mansour mentioning Hamas for the last 30 minutes he spoke here. It ignores the Hamas terror attack of October 7, ignores Israel's legitimate security concerns, and seeks to remove Israel's ability to protect itself. From the beginning, we all know that this process was politicized. This was not a quest for legal clarity, but a predetermined attempt to delegitimize Israel on the world stage. Let's call this for what it is. This resolution is diplomatic terrorism, using the tools of diplomacy not to build bridges, but to destroy them. And what other member state is treated that way? The answer is simple: none. No other country is subjected to such relentless, obsessive abuse. You know, it's not my first term here. I started my first term at the UN in 2015. Since then, there have been 155 General Assembly resolutions condemning Israel. In the same period, there have been only 88 resolutions condemning every other country combined. Combined! Think about the last decade. Think about how many brutal regimes exist in the world. Think about the countless injustices. Yet, the only Jewish state, the only democracy in the Middle East, has been condemned almost twice as much as the rest of the world combined. This is not about justice. It is about an attempt to destroy Israel through diplomatic terrorism. Make no mistake, since October 7, the Palestinian Authority has not condemned the atrocities committed by Hamas. Not one word of condemnation from President Abbas. Not one word from Prime Minister Mustafa. Not one word from Riyad Mansour. The Secretary General of Fatah Central Committee called the October 7 massacre a defensive war full of epics and heroisms. One of the most high-ranking Palestinian officials calling the rape and murder of thousands of civilians epic and heroic. Are these our partners in peace? The PA have offered their unwavering support for Hamas, the world's most despicable terrorist organization. They are its diplomatic wing, its public face, their consiglieres. The Palestinians deserve better leadership. For decades, Hamas has spent its money digging terror tunnels, arming terrorists, and bringing ruin to its own people. Rather than building up Gaza, Hamas has obsessed over one thing: destroying Israel. While Hamas digs tunnels, the Palestinian Authority works above ground, attempting to isolate Israel internationally. There are two sides of the same coin, one attacking with rockets, the other with resolutions. The Palestinian Authority has rededicated itself to supporting the world's most vicious terrorist. This is not an entity seeking peace. It is a regime that glorifies murder while educating its people to do the same. They refuse to denounce the most horrific crimes. They celebrate the slaughter of civilians as a victory. And now, this body is considering rewarding that refusal, rewarding that evil. You are giving a false prize to false leadership. There is only one side in this conflict that promotes genocide. It is the one that promotes it publicly. Let us not forget, Hamas's own founding charter calls, and I quote, for the extermination of all Jews. They proudly proclaim their intent, and I quote, to wipe Israel off the map and hunt Jews wherever they can find them. Instead of condemning the killers, the ones who want to commit a genocide, this resolution condemns the victims. How dare they accuse us of the crimes they themselves are committed to carrying out? This resolution seeks to deflect blame for Hamas's own atrocities onto Israel, which is forced to defend itself. This resolution perfectly represents the priorities of the Palestinian Authority. It slanders Israel, ignores our right to defend our people, and seeks to isolate us. The PA has teamed up with the radicals in the region, posing a grave threat not just to Israel, but to the entire Middle East. But instead of addressing these major threats, some of you support this resolution, which demands that Israel tie its ends. History has shown time and time again that true progress only comes through direct dialogue. Israel has demonstrated this for decades. Wonderful, important peace treaties have been signed with Egypt, Jordan, with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, Morocco. Inshallah, there will be many more in the near future. Trying to isolate and destroy Israel brings nothing but regression. This resolution doesn't move the region forward, it drags the region backward, delaying the hope for peace and advancement. I was here on this podium 6 years ago. I stood in this hall and proposed a resolution to condemn Hamas. But instead of taking action, the Assembly chose to look the other way, allowing Hamas to continue its reign of terror. And now we are all, Israelis and Palestinians alike, suffering the consequences of your inaction. Back then you chose to support the circus over morality, and here we are again, the same circus, the same performances. But we all know what's really happening here. This is not about peace. This is not about international law. This is about posturing. In the circus of the UN, you can ignore the atrocities that took place on October 7. You can pass resolutions detached from reality. You can pretend you live on a different planet. But in the real world, outside these halls, we are doing the hard work. We are fighting terror. We are working to bring the hostages home. In the real world, there is justice and morality. In the real world, Israel will shape its own future, striving for both victory and peace. Israel will defend itself. We will not apologize for protecting our citizens. We will not stop until Hamas is dismantled, until every one of our hostages is returned, and until the terror that threatens our people is eliminated. Today, this assembly faces a choice. You can choose to stand on the side of justice, on the side of peace, on the side of those who seek real solutions to the region's challenges, or you can indulge this circus, this charade, this political theater. Israel is ready to work with the international community. We are ready to work with those committed to real peace, real security, real progress. Israel will not work with those who refuse to renounce violence and acknowledge Israel's right to exist. Whoever supports this resolution today should be ashamed of themselves. On the day when your civilians, your families, your loved ones are murdered, raped, and kidnapped, do not come to this assembly seeking justice. All you will find is silence. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Israel. I now give the floor to His Excellency Peya Mushelenga, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of Namibia.
Mr. President, allow me to firstly congratulate you on your election as the President of the 79th session of the General Assembly. I also thank you for commencing your tenure by reconvening the 10th Emergency Special Session on illegal Israeli actions in occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory at the request of member states. This meeting takes place 2 months after the International Court of Justice rendered its seminal advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from Israeli policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and for the illegality of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. Namibia strongly supports and welcomes this advisory opinion, which we believe must be actioned through our collective effort to ensure it delivers for the people of Palestine. In convening this meeting, the General Assembly is, as rendered in the advisory opinion, able to consider precise modalities and further action to bring to an end as rapidly as possible the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. The request for this August Assembly to seek an advisory opinion from the ICJ was anchored in the fervent belief that the international judicial system can provide rational advice to assist us in charting the way forward on the question of Palestine, among the oldest unresolved agenda items for the General Assembly. Mr. President, the convening power of the General Assembly must continue to be used as a tool to effect meaningful change. As the world's most representative multilateral institution, the United Nations General Assembly continues to be an apt platform for the articulation of the voices of all nations of the world. We declare unequivocally in this August forum that there is no substitute for peace, and therefore move that Israel should henceforth genuinely commit to ending its 57 years occupation in line with ICJ advisory opinions, General Assembly and Security Council resolutions. We must work in unison, using all legitimate means at our disposal to halt Israel's non-compliance with international law. The resolution tabled before us in this emergency special session is to be considered before an assembly that has repeatedly affirmed its strong support for the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. The same assembly has also affirmed the right of the Palestinian people to statehood. It is incumbent on all member states to fulfill in good faith the obligations they have assumed in accordance with the UN Charter. Further, member states should take cognizance of the consequential nature of the ICJ advisory opinion, and that jointly and severally, member states and international organizations, including the UN, are ascribed onerous responsibilities. Primary among these responsibilities is the obligation not to recognize the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, and moreover, not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by the continued presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. Mr. President, Namibia has co-sponsored this resolution and will vote in its favor out of the fervent belief that its adoption would signify the international community's steadfast commitment towards ending impunity and supporting the progress towards lasting peace in the Middle East. We believe in exuding responsibility and duty to humanity. Accordingly, we encourage similar conscionable action from all member states. The resolution provides the international community with another opportunity to take a unified position in reasserting the key tenets of international law. Further, it reasserts the primacy of self-determination as an inalienable right that is not subject to the conditions of the occupying power. The resolution also sends a strong message to the world, and most especially to the Security Council, on the desires of the majority of the international community. Council members cannot continue to use veto power to perpetuate injustice and support impunity. More so, not at a time when the people of Palestine are ensnared by stalled ceasefire negotiations and a derailed peace process. While Council fails to execute its core responsibility of maintaining international peace and security, Gaza continues to be obliterated, offering no safe havens for civilians and humanitarian personnel. Infrastructure, including medical facilities, continues to be destroyed viciously, demonstrating callousness by the occupying power. Equally, the situation in the West Bank continues to deteriorate daily. This is particularly worrisome. The international system must offer more than mere words of solidarity to the people of Palestine. It is high time that tangible steps are taken to oblige Israel to end its atrocious attacks on the occupied Palestinian territory. In conclusion, Mr. President, Namibia will continue to tirelessly champion the cause for the total liberation of Palestine. We are pleased to see Palestine seated among the family of nations and will continue to call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the full membership of Palestine to the UN, and a renewed vision of a two-state solution that will enable the reconstruction of Gaza, leading to an independent Palestinian state, a safe Israel, and peace in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Minister for International Relations and Cooperation of Namibia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cameroon, who will speak on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the group of member states belonging to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in my capacity as the chair of the group. Mr. President, let me begin by commending you for the resumption of the 10th Emergency Special Session. There is no doubt that the present editions of the session, which were dedicated to addressing the grave humanitarian condition in the occupied Palestinian territory, have achieved positive outcomes, giving 3 landmark resolutions adopted by this august assembly since October 2023. The resolution on the need for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and elsewhere in the Occupied Palestinian Territory and global support for the admission of Palestine as a full-fledged member of the United Nations have justified the residual and complementary role of the United Nations General Assembly within the context of the maintenance of international peace and security. The group think that it is deeply regrettable that despite the hopeful expectation following the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 2728 on March 25, 2024, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, the human rights and humanitarian calamities in the occupied Palestinian territories have worsened. The death toll, predominantly women and children, has tragically reached an unprecedented number of 41,680. Additionally, over 1,525 people were injured and hundreds of thousands were displaced following the destruction of their homes, hospitals, and heritage and cultural sites. In view of the foregoing and given the grave threat to peace and security resulting from the long-drawn Middle East crisis, for our group, it is high time that practical measures be taken to end Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine. Accordingly, our group reiterates the call by the OIC on member states of the United Nations to exert diplomatic, political, and legal pressure and take necessary deterrent measures to stop the crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing committed by Israel, the occupying power, on the occupied Palestinian territory and Gaza. In this connection, our group welcomes and commend the objective of this emergency special session to consider an urgent follow-up action on the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, as well as the illegality of Israel's continued presence at the occupied Palestinian territory. Similarly, Mr. President, our group reiterates the recent OIC resolution adopted at the 50th Council of Foreign Ministers held in Yaoundé, Cameroon, on 29-30 August 2024, welcoming the historical advisory opinion of the ICG on illegal Israeli occupation of the Occupied Palestinian Territory and the legal consequences for Israel, the United Nations, and third parties, especially the ICG legal opinion, adjust the continued presence of the State of Israel on the Occupied Palestinian Territory to illegal, thus affirming Israel's obligation to end the presence in the Occupied Palestinian Territory as rapidly as possible. Mr. President, the advisory opinion of the ICG for our group, which will issue upon the request of this esteemed assembly, has determined the legal occupation of UN member states and international organizations with regard to the immediate implementation of the various provisions of the legal opinion by the principal judicial arm of the United Nations. Consequently, for our group, the draft resolution being presented today is properly anchored on the principle of international law as contained in relevant UN resolution and the judicial discrimination arising from the ICJ advisory opinion. It is therefore imperative to implement the ICJ advisory opinion on the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestine, including the assertion that Israel must end as unlawful presence, cease settlement activities, evacuate settlers, provide reparation, and that state and international organization should not recognize or aid Israel's illegal action on the occupied Palestinian territory. While commending this draft resolution for the overwhelming votes in favor and adoption by member pressure and take necessary deterrent measure to stop the crimes against humanity, war crime, and ethnic cleansing committed by Israel, the occupying power on the occupied Palestinian territory. In this connection, and in fact, the Assembly, in accordance to our group, it is important to note that your anticipated positive action would provide the needed respite in this long-drawn crisis in Palestine. Without doubt, this resolution will also contribute to the end of the settler colonial occupation of Palestine, which has always been at the heart of the Palestine crisis. Indeed, the global consensus, as evident from the various UN resolutions and relevant regional organizations, is that the definitive peaceful settlement of the Israel-Palestine crisis resides in a two-state solution, the realization of the inalienable national right of the Palestinian people and the establishment of an independent Palestine state on the 1967 borders, which is Jerusalem as its capital. Ultimately, the implementation of various UN resolutions remains the responsibility of this global body and all its peace-loving members. Finally, Mr. President, for our group, the adoption of the draft resolution in the run-up to the Summit of the Future represent a beacon of hope for the global transformation which we seek to realize in order to confront a growing range of catastrophic and existential risk attendant on the persistent crisis and breakdown within the global setting. I thank you all for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cameroon. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uganda, who shall speak on behalf of the non-aligned movement.
Mr. President, I'm honored to speak on behalf of the 121 member states of the non-aligned movement, NAM. I thank you for your swift response to the request to resume this 10th emergency special session, pursuant to the joint request made by the chairs of the non-aligned movement, Arab Group, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation on behalf of their member states. NAM welcomes the advisory opinion that was rendered by the International Court of Justice on 19th July 2024, pursuant to the request made by the General Assembly in its resolutions 77/247 of 30th December 2022. The determinations made by the court in accordance with international law require immediate follow-up by the Assembly to address this prolonged historic injustice, and particularly considering the extremely grave and worsening situation being endured by the Palestinian people in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem. NAM reiterates that respect of the UN Charter, international law, and UN resolutions constitute the foundation for a just and lasting solution of the Palestinian question as a cornerstone for regional and global peace and security. NAM acknowledges the role of the International Court of Justice, ICJ, in promoting justice and the peaceful settlement of international disputes in accordance with the relevant provisions of the UN Charter and the Statute of the ICJ. The non-aligned movement urges the Security Council to make a greater use of the ICJ, the principal judicial organ of the UN, as a source of advisory opinions and interpretation of relevant norms of international law to guide and assist international efforts to justly resolve protracted crises and conflicts and promote peaceful resolutions. We further urge the court, the council, to consider that its decisions be reviewed by the ICJ, bearing in mind the need to ensure their adherence to the UN Charter and international law. The General Assembly has rightly availed itself of the ICJ in seeking its authoritative guidance regarding this prolonged crisis, the question of Palestine, which has been on the United Nations agenda since the organization's inception. The Assembly's decision to turn to the court has been made after decades of the injustices endured by the Palestinian people, including the deprivation of their inalienable right to self-determination, the colonization and annexation of their land, and the discrimination amounting, as affirmed by the court, to violations of Article 3 of the CERD concerning racial segregation and apartheid. In response to the General Assembly's questions, the court has clearly determined earlier that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, is unlawful and must be ended as rapidly as possible. It is now time to translate the court's authoritative determinations into action for accountability towards ending this illegal occupation in all its manifestations and ensuring the realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including to self-determination and independence and the realization of a long-delayed justice. Mr. President, in this regard, the movement reiterates that the policies and measures being carried out in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, by Israel, the occupying power, constitute grave breaches of international law and flagrant defiance of UN resolutions, and the 9th July 2004 and 19th July 2024 advisory opinions of an International Court of Justice. In this regard, the movement recalls the responsibilities of states not to support, facilitate, or cooperate directly or indirectly with such unlawful policies and to undertake practical measures to bring them to a halt. We also urge the undertaking of serious efforts collectively and individually to ensure respect of the legal obligations defined in the ICJ Advisory Committee, including efforts by the General Assembly and by the high contracting parties to the Fourth Geneva Convention. The movement stresses that the UN Charter contains sufficient provisions regarding the use of force, including a clear pronouncement on the inadmissibility on the acquisition of territory by force. This prohibition must be respected in all circumstances in order to maintain and preserve international peace and security in full conformity with the relevant Charter provisions, including in earlier chapters 6, 7, and 8 of the Charter, as appropriate and consistent with international law as pronounced by the ICJ. In recent years, the Security Council has made too quick to threaten authorized enforcement action in some cases and has been increasingly resorting to Chapter 7 of the Charter as an umbrella for addressing issues that do not necessarily pose an immediate threat to international peace and security, while being silent and inactive in others, such as Palestinian question, that the ICJ considered it in its advisory opinion as conflicts continues to pose a threat to international peace and security and remains a matter of grave concern to the international community. NAM reiterates the demand that Israel, the occupying power, immediately cease all such violations of international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, and fully abide by its legal obligations, including under the Fourth Geneva Convention. NAM also notes the 29th December 2023 application filed by member states of the movement, South Africa, instituting proceedings against Israel before the ICJ concerning alleged violations by Israel of its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crimes of Genocide in relation to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. To conclude, the movement seizes this opportunity to reiterate its long-standing call for immediate collective international efforts to uphold international law to bring an end to this grave and historic injustice. Now member states reaffirm their commitment to promoting a just, lasting, comprehensive, peaceful solution to the question of Palestine in all its aspects in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions. NAM reaffirms its support to the Palestinian people in their struggle to achieve justice and fulfill their inalienable rights and legitimate national aspirations, including to return and to self-determination, freedom and independence in their sovereign and independent state of Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital, and stands ready to cooperate with and support the General Assembly and Security Council for the fulfillment of their respective responsibilities in this regard. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uganda. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, who shall speak on behalf of the Arab group.
Thank you, President.
السيدات والسادة،
Ladies and gentlemen,
يسعدني أن أدلي بهذا البيان نيابة عن المجموعة العربية.
on behalf of the Arab group.
ونتقدم إليكم السيد الرئيس
At the
بداية
outset,
بالتهنئة على توليكم رئاسة الدورة 79 للجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة، ونتمنى لكم التوفيق في هذه المهمة السامية. كما أتوجه إليكم بجزيل الشكر على استجابتكم للطلب الذي تقدمت به المجموعة العربية والمجموعة الإسلامية وحركة عدم الامتياز لاستئناف الدورة الاستثنائية الطارئة العاشرة، وذلك في ضوء إصدار محكمة العدل الدولية بتاريخ 19 تموز يوليو 2024 لرأيها الاستشاري حول الآثار القانونية الناشئة عن سياسات إسرائيل وممارساتها في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة بما فيها القدس الشرقية، وعن عدم مشروعية استمرار وجود إسرائيل في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة. لقد أكد هذا الرأي الاستشاري على عدم قانونية استمرار وجود إسرائيل في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة، وأن إسرائيل ملزمة بإنهاء وجودها غير القانوني في أسرع وقت ممكن، والوقف الفوري لجميع الأنشطة الاستيطانية وتفكيك المستوطنات وإخلاء المستوطنين من الأرض الفلسطينية. كما أكد الرأي الاستشاري أن إسرائيل ملزمة بدفع تعويضات عن الأضرار التي لحقت بجميع الأشخاص الطبيعيين أو الاعتباريين المعنيين، وأن جميع الدول والمنظمات الدولية ملزمة بعدم إضفاء أي نوع من الاعتراف أو الشرعية للوضع الناشئ عن الوجود المستمر وغير القانوني للاحتلال الإسرائيلي للأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة، وبعدم تقديم العون أو المساعدة في الإبقاء على هذا الوضع غير القانوني. ترحب المجموعة العربية بهذا الرأي الاستشاري الذي صدر بناء على طلب الجمعية العامة، وتشدد على ضرورة متابعته والعمل على تنفيذه وفقا لما أوصت به محكمة العدل الدولية في الفقرة الحكمية التاسعة من فتواها، والتي تنص على أنه يتعين على الأمم المتحدة وخاصة الجمعية العامة ومجلس الأمن النظر في الطرائق المحددة والإجراءات الإضافية اللازمة لوضع حد في أسرع وقت ممكن للوجود غير القانوني للاحتلال الإسرائيلي في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة. سيد الرئيس، عملا بتوصية محكمة العدل الدولية، قام وفد دولة فلسطين مدعوما من قبل عشرات الدول الأعضاء بتقديم مشروع القرار المعروض أمامكم اليوم، ونتقدم بهذه المناسبة بالتهنئة إلى دولة فلسطين لمباشرتها التمتع بالحقوق والامتيازات الإضافية التي أقرتها الجمعية العامة اعتبارا من هذه الدورة، والتي مكنت وفدها اليوم من تقديم مشروع القرار التاريخي هذا. وتتطلع المجموعة العربية لنيل دولة فلسطين العضوية الكاملة في الأمم المتحدة في أقرب وقت. السيدات والسادة، لقد مضى ما يقارب العام على بدء العدوان الإسرائيلي الغاشم على الشعب الفلسطيني في قطاع غزة، وأسفرت حرب الإبادة الجماعية التي ترتكبها قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي عن أكثر من 145 ألف مدني فلسطيني بين شهيد وجريح ومفقود، ناهيك عن تهجير ما يقارب مليوني فلسطيني والتدمير الممنهج للمدن والقرى والمخيمات الفلسطينية وبنيتها التحتية وحرق وتدمير المنازل والمزارع والممتلكات. ولم يقتصر الأمر على ذلك، بل وسعت إسرائيل القوة القائمة بالاحتلال وعصابات المستوطنين من نطاق جرائمهم إلى الضفة الغربية، حيث قتلت مئات المواطنين الفلسطينيين وألحقت إصابات بالغة بأعداد كبيرة غيرهم. تدين المجموعة العربية بأشد العبارات جرائم الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بحق الشعب الفلسطيني، وتطالب بوقفها الفوري وغير المشروع. كما تدين السياسات والإجراءات العدوانية التي تتخذها إسرائيل القوى القائمة بالاحتلال ضد تجسيد استقلال دولة فلسطين وإمعانها في خطط ضم الضفة الغربية المحتلة their plans to annex the occupied West Bank and to expand the colonizing settlements in the other Palestinian territories and the occupied Syrian Golan. The Arab Group reiterates its condemnation of the ongoing Israeli aggression for more than 11 months against brotherly Lebanon. We condemn the deliberate Israeli bombardments of civilian areas, which led to the killing of more than 175 civilians, most of whom are women and children, in addition to several journalists and relief workers. The group reiterates its condemnation of the repeated Israeli aggressions against the Syrian territories and the targeting by the Israeli occupation forces of civilians, of residential neighborhoods, and of the infrastructure. The group reaffirms its solidarity with Syria and Lebanon and calls for a cessation of the hostile Israeli actions immediately to avoid further escalation threatening regional and international peace and security. Mr. President, the General Assembly has resumed its 10th emergency special session on 3 occasions throughout the past 11 months. It has adopted 3 important resolutions calling for an immediate ceasefire and to guarantee the delivery of humanitarian assistance, in addition to granting additional privileges to Palestine. The members of the General Assembly are invited today again to show their support to the Palestinian people and its prolonged struggle to end the Israeli occupation of their land and to exercise their inalienable right to self-determination, to the establishment of their sovereign independent state with Jerusalem as its capital, and to be granted full membership in the United Nations. Solidarity with the Palestinian people and their legitimate rights means that we should support the draft resolution tabled before this session and vote in its favor. This is the least we can do to contribute to lifting the prolonged historic injustice that befell the Palestinian people. Mr. President, allow me to deliver the following remarks in my national capacity. My delegation associates itself with the statement of the Arab Group and the statement delivered by the permanent representative of Uganda on behalf of NAM. We congratulate you once again for presiding over this session, and we affirm that my delegation is ready to provide all support for the success of your endeavors. We also thank you for swiftly responding to our request to convene this emergency session. Mr. President, the Syrian Arab Republic reiterates its strong condemnation of the ongoing barbaric Israeli aggression against the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. This aggression represents a continuation of the massacres, acts of aggression and terrorism perpetrated by the Israeli occupation throughout decades to perpetuate its occupation of our territories and in an attempt to undermine the chances of establishing a Palestinian state. Syria reaffirms its full support to the brotherly Palestinian people in facing the Israeli killing machinery and in their struggle to end occupation and to enjoy their inalienable established rights, including their right to establish an independent state with Jerusalem as a capital and to be granted full membership in the United Nations. My country welcomes the advisory opinion of the ICJ and calls for its implementation to end the Israeli occupation. Syria reaffirms that the Israeli occupation was and still is the main cause of the instability in our region. Syria calls upon the United Nations to act immediately to implement its relevant resolutions and to end occupation, to end the policies of aggression, of expansion, of settlement, and of genocide, in addition to the war crimes, crimes against humanity perpetrated by the occupying powers. The occupying powers wouldn't have persisted in these practices if it weren't for the unlimited support provided to it by the U.S. administration and some of their allies. Syria calls upon the United Nations to end the repeated Israeli aggressions against its territories. including the most recent assault against rural Hama province and Masjid Shams and Arab Syrian occupied Golan. We call for holding the occupying powers accountable for their practices and to ensure that they are not repeated in order to avoid dragging the region towards more escalation, threatening regional and international peace and security. My country reaffirms its established right to defend its territorial sovereignty and to recover the occupied Syrian Golan using all the means provided by international law. We also condemn the ongoing Israeli aggression against Lebanon. We reiterate our strong solidarity with the Lebanese people and call for an immediate, unconditional cessation of such an aggression. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President,
primero que todo deseamos felicitarlo por su reciente designación como presidente de la Asamblea General. Hacemos extensivos los buenos deseos de éxitos al resto de la mesa que usted dirigirá por este año. Chile suscribe la intervención realizada por Uganda en nombre del movimiento de los países no alineados. Agradecemos esta convocatoria al 10º periodo extraordinario de sesiones de emergencia de la Asamblea General para discutir un proyecto de resolución presentado por Palestina titulado Seguimiento de la opinión consultiva de la Corte Internacional de Justicia sobre las consecuencias jurídicas de las políticas y prácticas de Israel en el territorio palestino ocupado, incluida Jerusalén Oriental, y de la ilegalidad de la presencia continua de Israel en el territorio palestino ocupado. Nuestro país copatrocinó este borrador e instamos a respaldarlo. Recordamos que el 30 de diciembre de 2022, en su resolución 77/247, esta misma Asamblea General aprobó una opinión consultiva de la Corte Internacional de Justicia llamada Prácticas israelíes que afectan los derechos humanos del pueblo palestino en el territorio palestino ocupado, incluyendo Jerusalén Oriental. En tal ocasión, mi país votó a favor, igual como lo realizaremos en esta oportunidad. Chile ha insistido que se debe dar cabal y pronto cumplimiento a las resoluciones pertinentes que respaldan el derecho del pueblo palestino a constituir un Estado soberano, como son las resoluciones 181 y 242 de esta Asamblea General, y también aquellas relacionadas como la resolución 2334 del Consejo de Seguridad, donde se reafirma que el establecimiento de asentamientos por parte de Israel en el territorio palestino ocupado, incluida Jerusalén Oriental, no tiene validez legal y constituye una violación del derecho internacional. Reafirmamos nuestro apoyo al Estado de Palestina para que sea admitido como miembro de pleno derecho de las Naciones Unidas. Señor Presidente, deseamos expresar una vez más las condolencias de Chile a las familias y seres queridos de las víctimas que han muerto en el conflicto que azota a la Franja de Gaza y que con el paso del día solo aumenta. Somos especialmente sensibles por las mujeres y los niños inocentes que han padecido en esta catástrofe. Subrayamos que la violencia no se soluciona con más violencia. Extendemos nuestra profunda solidaridad con los heridos. Reiteramos el completo apoyo al dedicado y valiente trabajo que están realizando las Naciones Unidas, sus agencias y particularmente la UNRWA en terreno. Con mucho pesar sentimos la muerte de más de 220 funcionarios de esta agencia humanitaria en esta guerra. Por esto, Con conmoción nos enteramos la semana pasada del ataque israelí a una escuela de la UNRWA en la que murieron 18 personas, entre ellas 6 trabajadores de esta agencia. Esto es totalmente inaceptable y una evidente violación del derecho internacional. Recordamos la resolución 2730 del Consejo de Seguridad, adoptada el 24 de mayo de este año, que exige que las partes en conflicto cumplan con sus obligaciones bajo el derecho internacional e insta a todos los estados a emprender de inmediato investigaciones exhaustivas e imparciales sobre las violaciones perpetradas contra el personal humanitario y de la ONU. Recalcamos que la protección a la vida humana debe ser nuestra máxima prioridad y la protección a los civiles es una obligación fundamental. Por esto, se debe respetar la Carta de la ONU, el derecho internacional y el derecho internacional humanitario. Indudablemente, este respeto ha sido infringido por los actos terroristas perpetrados por Hamás el 7 de octubre pasado y la respuesta indiscriminada del Estado de Israel sobre la población que habita en la Franja de Gaza y que también ha afectado a Cisjordania. Chile ha condenado sin matices las acciones de Hamás, al igual que todo acto terrorista, hechos de violencia y hostilidades contra la población civil. Por lo anterior, exigimos la liberación inmediata y sin condiciones de todos los rehenes aún en manos de Hamás, velando por su bienestar y trato en conformidad al derecho internacional. Nos preocupa el asedio impuesto por Israel a la Franja de Gaza porque ha significado dejar a su población sin sus necesidades básicas, tales como alimento, agua, medicinas y combustible, provocando hambre generalizada y enfermedades. Condenamos la ofensiva militar de Israel contra la ciudad de Rafah. Las consecuencias de esta operación militar son nefastas y solo dilatan la estabilidad de la región. Es de profunda preocupación la prolongación de la violencia. Hacemos eco del llamado del propio secretario general y los respectivos jefes de otras agencias de la ONU para disminuir las tensiones. Distinguimos los esfuerzos de la Coordinadora Humanitaria y de la Reconstrucción en Gaza, señora Sigrid Kaag, en sus labores y abogamos para que reciba todas las facilidades para llevar a cabo su cometido. Agradecemos la claridad de la ponencia que ella realizó ayer lunes en el Consejo de Seguridad. Chile solicita un alto al fuego inmediato y permanente, un mayor flujo de asistencia humanitaria hacia Gaza, garantías para el acceso pleno, inmediato, seguro, sin trabas y sostenido de ayuda humanitaria, es decir, que se eliminen todos los obstáculos a dicha asistencia y facilitar el uso de todas las rutas terrestres disponibles para ingresar a la Franja de Gaza. Alabamos que la campaña de vacunación contra la poliomielitis en Gaza se esté realizando durante las pausas humanitarias acordadas. Alentamos que los equipos de ayuda logren el objetivo de llegar a más niños y niñas en riesgo. Animamos a todas las partes involucradas, así como a la comunidad internacional, a seguir trabajando para terminar esta guerra. Esto solo es posible a través de la vía diplomática y el diálogo. Reconocemos los esfuerzos y resultados que países amigos han logrado para reducir las tensiones. Esperamos que los buenos oficios de Estados Unidos, Egipto y Qatar se puedan concretar. Destacamos las 4 resoluciones aprobadas en el Consejo de Seguridad en pos de conseguir el cese del fuego, aminorarlo o brindar facilidades a la ayuda humanitaria, la 2712 y la 2720, adoptadas el año pasado, y especialmente la 2728 y la 2735 de este año. Recordamos que todas las resoluciones de este órgano son vinculantes y deben ser acatadas y respetadas. Señor Presidente, Chile promueve la solución de los dos estados y el derecho de Israel y Palestina a vivir en armonía dentro de fronteras internacionales seguras y reconocidas y con total respeto a los derechos humanos de todos sus habitantes. Chile siempre ha reafirmado como prioridad de su política exterior el contribuir a alcanzar una solución pacífica en el Medio Oriente, comentando constantemente nuestro apoyo a una solución justa y duradera conforme a las resoluciones de las Naciones Unidas. Recordamos que Chile, junto con México, remitió a la Corte Penal Internacional un escrito sobre la situación en Palestina para reforzar la investigación de los presuntos crímenes de guerra y crímenes de lesa humanidad cometidos en Gaza, Cisjordania, Jerusalén Este e Israel.
East Jerusalem
Para Chile,
and
el
Israel.
esclarecimiento de los
For
hechos y
Chile, shedding light
responsabilidades,
on the facts
así
and
como la rendición de
responsibility,
cuentas,
as well
son
as
esenciales para poner
accountability, are
fin a la
essential to bring an
impunidad
end to
y
impunity and to
prevenir la
prevent the
futura
future
comisión
commission of
de
international
crímenes
crimes.
internacionales. Subrayamos que
We
las medidas
underscore that
cautelares
the interim
adoptadas
measures
por la Corte
adopted by the
Internacional de
International
Justicia
Court of Justice
deben ser
must be
cumplidas por
complied with by
todas
all
las partes.
parties.
El jueves de la semana pasada, Chile presentó
On Thursday
ante la
last
Corte
week,
Internacional
Chile
de Justicia
presented to
su
the International
escrito
Court of
de
Justice
intervención
its
en el marco de la
submission
demanda
following
presentada por
the case
Sudáfrica
brought by South
contra
Africa
Israel
against
sobre
Israel.
la aplicación
This
de la
relates
Convención
to the
para la prevención y la sanción del
implementation of the
delito de
application of
genocidio
the
en la Franja de
Convention for the
Gaza.
Prevention and Punishment
Esta
of the Crime of
declaración fue
Genocide
presentada de
in the
acuerdo
Gaza
con lo
Strip.
previsto en el
This
artículo
statement
63
was
del
presented in
Estatuto de
line
la
with the
Corte,
provisions of
que
Article
establece el derecho de
63 of
cualquier
the
Estado
Court's
a
statute.
intervenir
This
cuando se
establishes
trate de
the
la
right of
interpretación
any
de una
state to
convención
intervene
en la
in
cual
matters
también es
pertaining
parte.
to the interpretation
El escrito
of a
nacional se
convention or a
centra en
treaty to which
analizar
they are a
disposiciones
party.
específicas de la
This
Convención
national submission
para la
is
prevención y la
focused on an
sanción
analysis
del
of the
delito de
specific
genocidio,
provisions
así como la
of
posición de
the
Chile
Genocide
sobre su
Convention,
interpretación.
as well as
En el
Chile's
texto también se alude
position on its
a la reciente
interpretation.
opinión consultiva de
The
la
text
Corte
also
Internacional de
alludes to the recent
Justicia
advisory
sobre las
opinion of the
consecuencias
International Court of
jurídicas
Justice
derivadas
on the
de las
legal
políticas y
consequences
prácticas de
of the
Israel en el
policies and
territorio
practices
palestino
of Israel
ocupado,
in the occupied
incluida
Palestinian
Jerusalén
territory,
Este,
including
del
East
19 de julio
Jerusalem,
de
dated the 19th
2024,
of July
en la cual se
2024.
concluyó
In
que el
that
régimen de
advisory
restricciones
opinion, the court
integrales
concludes that
impuesto por
the
Israel a los palestinos
regime of
en el
comprehensive
territorio palestino
restrictions imposed
ocupado,
by Israel on
comillas,
Palestinians in the occupied
constituye una
Palestinian territory
discriminación
represents, I
sistemática
quote,
basada,
a
entre otras
systematic
cosas, en la raza, la
discrimination
religión
based inter
o el
alia
origen
on race,
étnico,
religion,
cierre
or
de comillas.
ethnic origin.
En la
End
intervención
quote.
nacional se sostiene que la
In our
Corte Internacional de
national
Justicia
submission, we
debería
maintain
dar
that the
especial
International Court
importancia
of
al
Justice
contenido de las
must grant
declaraciones
particular
de algunos
importance
funcionarios
to the
públicos
content
israelíes
of
de alto
the
nivel
statements of
que han hecho
certain
llamamientos
high-level
para
Israeli
matar
public
a todas las
officials
personas
who
que viven
have
en
called
Gaza
for the
o a
killing of
ignorar
everyone
su
living in
estatus
Gaza or for
civil.
their civilian status to be
Asimismo,
disregarded.
se afirma que la incitación
Furthermore, the
directa y
submission
pública a
also
cometer genocidio
affirms
es un
that
delito
direct
autónomo,
incitement and public
castigado bajo la
incitement
Convención,
to commit
incluso
genocide
si no
is a
produce el
standalone
resultado
crime
esperado por el autor,
punished under the
si no existe
Convention,
relación
even where it
causal
doesn't
entre el
lead to the
discurso y los
result
actos
expected by
posteriores,
the
y si de
perpetrator,
ello
where there
no
is
se
no,
deriva
even where there's
ningún
no
acto de
causal link
genocidio.
between what
Señor
is said and
Presidente,
subsequent acts,
para
and
finalizar comparto
where
la siguiente
no act of
reflexión.
genocide results
Estamos
therefrom.
a pocos días de celebrar la cumbre del
To
futuro.
conclude, I would like to share
Hemos
the following
trabajado todos
thought. In a few days'
arduamente
time,
para
we'll be
acordar
celebrating the
un
Summit of the
pacto
Future. We
para el
have
futuro.
worked together
Sin
hard
embargo,
to agree a
no hay
pact for the
futuro
future.
sostenible
However,
si
there
no
will be no
abordamos y
sustainable
solucionamos
future if we do
situaciones
not
tan
address
graves
and
como la
resolve
que hoy se vive en la
situations
Franja
that
de
are
Gaza.
just as
Es fundamental
serious as
primero
that is
por la
currently being
vida de las
experienced in
personas
the
que
Gaza
habitan ese
Strip.
territorio,
It's firstly
pero lo es también
fundamental
para las
for
Naciones
the
Unidas
lives of the people
como
living in that
organización que
territory, but
nace
also
para
for the United
garantizar la
Nations
paz
as an
y la
organization
seguridad.
that was born to
Si
guarantee
nos
peace and
comprometemos con un
security.
multilateralismo
If we are
renovado,
committed to renewed
comprometámonos también con un
multilateralism,
mundo
let us
donde los
also
acuerdos
commit
a los que
to
hemos
a
llegado
world in which
se
the
honren.
agreements that we've reached
La
are honored.
confianza en el sistema
Trust in the
multilateral
multilateral
también
system
depende
also
que los
depends
conflictos armados que
on
hoy
armed
enfrentamos
conflicts that we are
tengan una
facing
respuesta
today
efectiva y
being
contundente
effectively and
de parte
robustly
de este
addressed by this
organismo.
body.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, please accept our felicitations on assuming the presidency of the 79th session of the General Assembly. We thank you also for convening this resumed 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly in response to the requests of the Arab, the OIC, and the non-aligned movement. My delegation aligns with the statement made by the ambassadors of Cameroon on behalf of the OIC and of Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement. Mr. President, the purpose of this emergency session is to translate into action the historic and comprehensive advisory opinion delivered by the International Court of Justice on 19 July 2024, on the legal consequences of Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Pakistan has co-sponsored the draft resolution contained in document ES 10/L31 Rev 1, presented with its enhanced rights by the State of Palestine, which seeks to implement the conclusions of the ICJ. Mr. President, the tragic history of Palestine and its people has been caused by a series of legal and political decisions imposed by colonial and imperial powers. From the Balfour Declaration, the epitome of political betrayal, to the Anglo-American decision to allow Jews persecuted by the Nazis to emigrate to Israel, to the plan to partition Palestine embodied in the ignominious Resolution 181 adopted by this Assembly despite the just Arab and Islamic opposition, to the precipitate admission of Israel to the United Nations. Pakistan's founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, warned in 1948 that Israel's creation would have grave consequences for the peoples of the region. History is witness to these consequences. A state foisted on the land of the Palestinians, the brutal expulsion of the Palestinians in the Nakba, and expansion of the illegal state, the complete occupation of all of Palestine by Israeli military aggression in 1967, a brutal occupation which has lasted 50 years, the steady acquisition of Palestinian lands, properties, and homes to accommodate illegal and aggressive Jewish settlers, the imposition of a segregated apartheid rule in occupied Palestine, the unlawful incarceration of thousands of Palestinians subjected to torture, deprivation, and humiliation, the 30-year siege of Gaza, and now the frequent violations visited on innocent Palestinians, including indiscriminate aerial and land bombardment, killing thousands of mostly women and children, which is now writ large in the ongoing genocide in Gaza, where 41,000 Palestinians have been killed and almost 100,000 injured. A conflict which threatens to spread across and engulf the entire Middle East. Mr. President, against this grim background, the ICJ's advisory opinion marks a milestone of justice, an expression of equity, and a flame of hope. The ICJ's conclusions emphasize that Israel's occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, and its attempts to prolong the occupation and its security policies violate two basic principles of international law. One, the right of peoples to self-determination, and two, the principle of non-acquisition of territory by the use of force. In accordance with the ICJ's advisory opinion, the draft resolution demands that Israel immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territories, immediately put an end to its unlawful policies and procedures, make reparation for damages caused, comply with the ICJ's orders and ensure that the Palestinian people can exercise their right to self-determination without impediment. The draft resolution also underlines the need to hold Israel accountable for its violations of international law and to bear the consequences of all its wrongful actions, including by making reparations for injury and damage caused through the establishment of an international mechanism and an international register of damage. Mr. President, importantly, the ICJ's advisory opinion also indicates the obligations of member states in relation to Israel's occupation. Accordingly, the draft resolution inter alia calls on member states in compliance with their obligations to promote Palestinian self-determination, to refuse to recognize any change in the institutional structure and status of the occupied territory, and not to recognize or provide aid or assistance in maintaining Israeli occupation. Furthermore, the draft resolution calls on international organizations, including the United Nations, not to recognize as legal the situation arising from Israel's illegal occupation. The Secretary General has also been asked to submit a report on the implementation of this resolution within 3 months. Mr. President, the adoption of the draft resolution before us will require a re-evaluation of the position of member states and the United Nations, especially the Security Council, with regard to Palestine. First, this should reinvigorate the efforts of the international community to oblige Israel to halt its genocidal military campaign in Gaza and its operations in the West Bank, and to withdraw its forces forthwith from there. Second, those states which are continuing to provide military and material support to Israel must halt this in accordance with their obligation not to help in perpetuating Israeli occupation. Third, we must take concrete steps to enable the Palestinians to exercise their right to self-determination. One important step is to admit the State of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. Another would be to convene the International Conference on Palestine to advance the two-state solution. Mr. President, Pakistan will actively promote the realization of the objectives and decisions arising from the ICJ's advisory opinion and the adoption of the draft resolution in document L31 Rev 1. Pakistan's solidarity with the Palestinian people predates the independence of our own country. We realized independence through the exercise of self-determination. On 14 August 47, our founding father, Quaid-e-Azam, stated, and I quote, "No nation, no people who are worth living as a nation can achieve anything great without making great sacrifice, such as the Arabs of Palestine are making." In 1948, he pledged to aid the cause, I quote, of the Arabs in Palestine in every possible way. Mr. President, we have lived up to that commitment, and we will continue to live up to that commitment. The opinion of the ICJ and the adoption of the draft resolution before us will be one decisive step towards ending the suffering of the Palestinian people. Inshallah, Palestine will soon be free. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt. رئيس أهنئكم على تولي رئاسة الجمعية العامة وتشدد مصر
presiding over the General Assembly, and we would like to associate ourselves with the statements delivered by the non-aligned movement, the OIC, and the Arab group. We meet today, Mr. President, after the Arab and Islamic groups and the non-aligned movement requested the resumption of the 10th emergency special session to submit the draft resolution before us today. A/ES-10/10/31, which, and for the first time in the history of the General Assembly, is being submitted by the State of Palestine, and it pertains to the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and that is an implementation of GA Resolution 77/247 of the year 2022.
لقد ذهبت فلسطين وبدعم من الدول المحبة للسلام والمؤمنة بالقانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة ومصداقيته للحصول على هذا الرأي الاستشاري واستصدار قرارات واضحة للجمعية العامة ومجلس الأمن انطلاقا من إرادة صادقة لإيجاد حل سلمي للقضية الفلسطينية وفقا للقانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة وإيمانا بأن العنف لم ولن يكون الحل أبدا للصراع في منطقة شرق الأوسط. سيد الرئيس، جاء الرأي الاستشاري لمحكمة العدل كاشفا أن حق الشعب الفلسطيني في ممارسة حق تقرير المصير وإنهاء الاحتلال أقامت الدولة الفلسطينية على حدود 4 يونيو 1967 وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية واضح وجلي. كما أكدت المحكمة على مخالفة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي للضفة الغربية والقدس الشرقية وقطاع غزة للقانون الدولي واعتبار الاحتلال بمثابة انتهاك فارغ حق تقرير المصير الذي يعد من المبادئ الآمرة للقانون الدولي. استخداما مستمر للقوة المسلحة على أراضٍ أجنبية بهدف ضمها إلى إسرائيل وفرض سيادتها عليها بشكل فاقد للشرعية. إن الممارسات الإسرائيلية ضد الفلسطينيين في الأراضي المحتلة تنتهك المادة الثالثة من اتفاقية منع التمييز العنصري، بالإضافة إلى ما قررته محكمة العدل الدولية أيضا بإلزام إسرائيل بإنهاء الاحتلال بما في ذلك تفكيك المستوطنات وإجلاء المستوطنين وتعويض الفلسطينيين والسماح بعودة الفلسطينيين المهجرين أثناء الاحتلال إلى ديارهم الأصلية. سيد الرئيس، نذكركم جميعا بأن أغلب ما انتهى إليه الرأي الاستشاري الحالي لمحكمة العدل الدولية سبق أن أقرته المحكمة منذ 20 عاما في رأيها الصادر بشأن الجدار العازل، وهو الرأي الذي ظل حبرا على ورق. سيد الرئيس، تؤكد مصر على أن الرأي الاستشاري للمحكمة قد أقر بأن المجتمع الدولي بأسره جميع الدول الأعضاء في الأمم المتحدة يقع على عاتقه التزامات قانونية في مقدمتها العمل على تمكين الشعب الفلسطيني وممارسة حقه في تقرير المصير، بالإضافة إلى حظر اتخاذ أي إجراءات قد تنطوي على اعتراف بالاحتلال أو أي من الأوضاع الناشئة عنه، بما في ذلك نقل السفارات إلى الأراضي المحتلة، الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة، أو الدخول في معاهدات أو إقامة علاقات تجارية مع أنشطة إسرائيلية متصلة بالاحتلال. كما أقر الرأي الاستشاري بأن الأمم المتحدة وكافة أجهزتها السياسية ووكالاتها المتخصصة ملزمة هي الأخرى بالعمل على إنهاء الاحتلال واتخاذ التدابير اللازمة لضمان امتثال إسرائيل لما انتهت إليه المحكمة من ضرورة إنهاء الاحتلال فوراً. يشدد السيد الرئيس على أن الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بمستوطناته ومستوطنيه المتطرفين لن يستطيع الاستمرار في الحياة إذا ما قررت الدول التي تحترم القانون الدولي وأحكام محكمة العدل الدولية مقاطعته ووقف التعاون والتعايش معه. لقد بات إنهاء الاحتلال ورفع سلوك إسرائيل العدواني للشعب الفلسطيني ضرورة ملحة للحفاظ على الأمن الدولي أو ما تبقى من الاستقرار الإقليمي بتعبير أدق بعد أن تمادت إسرائيل في كافة انتهاكاتها المرتبطة باحتلالها للأراضي الفلسطينية كما تمادت في عدوانها على الأمم المتحدة ذاتها بقتل أكثر من 220 موظفا أمميا ومساعيها المستهجنة لسن قانون يجرم وكالة الأونروا كمنظمة إرهابية في سابقة لم تحدث ونتصور أنها لن تحدث وصم جهاز أممي للإرهاب. السيد الرئيس صدر رأي استشاري لمحكمة العدل الدولية في وقت تستمر فيه آلة الحرب الإسرائيلية في تدمير قطاع غزة. فقد حصلت أرواح أكثر من 40,000 شهيد، صابت أكثر من 94,000 فلسطيني، وعرقلت وصول المساعدات الإنسانية بالمخالفة للقوانين الدولية وقرارات الأمم المتحدة، خاصة القرار 27/2020. دون أفق لمجلس الأمن، دون أفق واضح ينهي معاناة الشعب الفلسطيني، بالإضافة إلى شن إسرائيل حملة عسكرية على الضفة الغربية وتشجيعها على الاستيطان في الضفة الغربية والقدس الشرقية وتهديدها الوضع القائم بالمقدسات الدينية بالقدس والتضييق الذي تمارسه على عمل السلطة الفلسطينية الممثل الشرعي للشعب الفلسطيني. كل ذلك بهدف إنهاء وجود الفلسطينيين على أراضيهم ومحاولة تصفية السيد الرئيس نشدد هنا مجددا على مطالبنا السابقة بحتمية إصدار مجلس الأمن لقرار وفق الفصل السابع يلزم إسرائيل بوقف العدوان بشكل فوري وإنفاذ المساعدات دون عوائق، حفظ السلم والأمن الدوليين ومساءلتها على انتهاكاتها للقانون الدولي وعدم تنفيذ قرارات مجلس الأمن. السيد الرئيس إيمانا من مصر بدعم السلام والاستقرار الإقليمي تواصل مصر جهود الوساطة مع قطر والولايات المتحدة للتوصل لصفقة تؤمن وقف إطلاق النار لإنهاء هذه المأساة غير المسبوقة. تقوم مصر بذلك في إطار مسؤولياتها الإقليمية والدولية دون الالتفات لبعض التصريحات غير المسؤولة لرئيس الوزراء الإسرائيلي ضد مصر الرامية لتشتيت انتباه الرأي العام الإسرائيلي كما ستواصل مصر جهودها مع أشقائها العرب وشركائها الدوليين لاستئناف عملية تفاوضية تمنح الشعب الفلسطيني
a negotiations process that would guarantee the Palestinian people the right in a liberated country that is contiguous on the lands within the borders of the 4th of June 1967, with Jerusalem at its capital, in accordance with international criteria and resolutions and the peace process which acknowledges the two-state solution. This requires us all to exert a genuine effort and to be committed by turning words into deeds in the international community and through responding with and working with the Arab efforts. This requires a firm position with Israel to force it to return to the negotiations table and end occupation after the recent escalation shows the impossibility of the theory that Israel's security is based on force and power. For the sake of what is right, for the sake of what is just, Egypt asks you to vote in favor of the draft resolution that will be presented tomorrow in order to maintain and preserve the credibility of this organization to support peaceful solution to the Palestinian cause and other causes, to maintain our rights to live in dignity and in freedom and to uphold justice and what is right. I thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, let me begin by congratulating you on assuming the presidency of the General Assembly and to express our appreciation for convening this 10th emergency special session. This session reflects the gravity of the situation and the collective responsibility of this body to address it. As a co-sponsor of this resolution introduced by Palestine and a committed advocate of the International Court of Justice proceedings, Turkey regards this session as both timely and essential. Mr. President, the Court's advisory opinion delivered on July 19th, upon the request of this august body, categorically determined the illegality of Israel's deliberately prolonged occupation of Palestinian territories. The ICJ's ruling, as the highest judicial body within the UN system, reaffirms what has long been the consensus of the international community, which is the occupation is lawful and must be ended. This conclusion not only provides a legal foundation, but also reinforces the political will of the majority of member states. The forthcoming vote on the resolution presented by Palestine is of historical significance. It not only constitutes the first resolution presented by Palestine to the General Assembly, but also symbolizes a pivotal step in the Palestinian people's pursuit of justice. The resolution is not merely procedural. It is emblematic of a broader movement within the international community to rectify long-standing injustices. Therefore, vital that we, as the member states, act in line with the ICJ's findings and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Turkey urges all member states to support this resolution as it is consistent with the international law and the legal framework established by the ICJ. The resolution's adoption would mark a crucial reaffirmation of the collective commitment to upholding international legal norms. Mr. President, this resolution underscores three critical dimensions of the current situation. First, it reinforces the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. Implementing the Court's advisory opinion is imperative if we are to uphold the core principle that territorial acquisition by force is inadmissible. Second, the international community must signal clearly that violations of international law will not be tolerated. The occupation and ongoing settlement activities in the West Bank are not only illegal, but undermine the prospects for peace. Accountability in this case is not just a moral imperative, but a legal one. Third, the ongoing conflict in Gaza, now in its 11th month, exacerbates an already dire humanitarian crisis. The resolutions passed by this Assembly, as well as the Security Council resolutions 2728 and 2725, calling for a ceasefire, remain unheeded. The suffering of the Palestinian people continues unabated, and the lack of the implementation highlights the urgent need for concrete action. Adoption of the resolution is crucial to reinforce the international community's call for a ceasefire and to halt the illegal settlement activities that perpetuate the conflict. Turkey has been an active participant in the ICJ process, contributing both written and oral submissions to the advisory opinion. We will continue our efforts to ensure an immediate and lasting ceasefire, as well as unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and work towards the recognition of the State of Palestine and a viable two-state solution. In conclusion, The decisions made in this assembly will have lasting implications, not only for the Palestine, but for the credibility of international law and the UN. The international community must demonstrate that it is prepared to enforce the standards it has set, and that justice, even if it is delayed, will ultimately prevail. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting. Mr. President, international law is the pillar of a stable global society, ensuring justice, protection of freedom, and enabling countries to thrive. Without them, chaos disrupts global peace and progress. The ICJ, the world's court, has made it clear: Israel's occupation of Palestine is illegal. Continued global inaction, enabled through the might is right, has allowed this occupation to thrive, causing injustice and tremendous suffering to the Palestinian people. The Assembly must now act on the ICJ ruling. The occupation must end. Indonesia therefore wholeheartedly support the draft resolution tabled by the State of Palestine. It contains legitimate actions that address these injustices. In this context, allow me to emphasize 3 points. First, implementation of the ICJ advisory opinion is the embodiment of our belief and commitment to international law and order. The ruling is more than just legal authority. It is a moral imperative. All states must recognize the State of Palestine, support the full membership in the United Nations, and uphold its rights to self-determination. The systematic structure of apartheid, discrimination, and injustice must be dismantled. Second, we must safeguard the integrity of the UN Charter and our basic human value. Allowing the illegal occupation of Palestine to continue undermines the very foundation of the international system that was built to preserve justice, moral value, and humanity. Let us be honest. Can we say to the children in Gaza, in the West Bank, and East Jerusalem that there will be a tomorrow for them? No, we cannot. We cannot even say this to children staying in Israelis' designated humanitarian safe zone. In the eyes of the general public, this body's default position is standing idle, while the basic right to life of Palestinians is taken away by a vindictive government. What will remain of the sanctity of international law? Third, we must pursue political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The clarity of the ICJ ruling is the illegality of Israel's occupation of Palestine. We must demand all of us to take a clear political will that we must safeguard the two-state solution. We need to convene an international conference for peace negotiation where Palestine stands on equal footing. The time for decisive action is now. We must move towards peace. Mr. President, let us act to resolve, to ensure that the promise of peace and dignity becomes a reality for every child and human being in Gaza and beyond. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
President, Excellencies, on 19 July, the International Court of Justice, upon the request of this General Assembly, delivered its advisory opinion regarding the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem. The court found that Israel's continued presence in the Occupied Palestinian Territory is unlawful, and that it is under an obligation to end it as soon as possible. Among the legal consequences emanating from this advisory opinion is a responsibility on the part of the General Assembly, as well as the Security Council, to consider the precise modalities and further action required to end Israel's unlawful presence. In this context, Malta reaffirms its unwavering commitment to international law. Adherence to it is essential to advancing peace, security, and justice. Respecting and implementing the findings of international judicial institutions, including the ICJ, is fundamental. All states must respect the decisions of our institutions and cooperate fully in their implementation. Our multilateral system depends on it. President, across the occupied Palestinian territory, Palestinians have been facing a desperate reality for 57 years. They are forced to contend with discriminatory legislation and frequent human rights violations. A continued occupation will only serve to make the two-state solution and the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination seem like a distant and unattainable abstraction. As member states, we have a responsibility to move this forward, a duty outlined by the ICJ. This includes not recognizing as legal Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining this occupation. All settlement activities must cease immediately. They are illegal under international law, undermine the contiguity of a future Palestinian state, and are a breach of the Palestinian people's fundamental right to self-determination. President, tens of thousands of civilians have been killed in the Gaza war, and many more have had their lives destroyed. Hostages abducted by Hamas and their families continue to live through a perpetual nightmare. An immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza needs to be realized urgently. The hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. We have echoed this message consistently since 7th October. This catastrophic war has only illustrated the need to address the root causes of this conflict and take tangible steps towards the realization of the two-state solution in line with Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. This path requires courage, principled decisions, and full respect of international law. This is why Malta will be supporting the resolution before us today. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malta. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya.
Mr. President, in the outset, allow me to speak in English, as I wish today to have my messages sent clear and not lost in translation. At the same time, I would like to align myself with the statements of the Arab group, the Islamic group, and the non-alignment movement. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to debate this resolution regarding the advisory opinion of the ICJ on the legal consequences arising from the unlawful occupation by the Israeli forces of the Palestinian territory, which Libya was proud to join its deliberations. This resolution presented by the delegation of the State of Palestine is by itself a historic moment, being the first action they take after getting their deserved, long-awaited privileges since the starting of this 29th year session. Unfortunately, they had to wait 79 years for that to happen. So in that regard, it's important to remind you that it's about time also to grant them the full membership of the United Nations. But while I'm standing here before you today, I find myself challenged and struggling to understand what are we exactly debating. Ordinary people watching us would question this, because simply we are debating whether we should comply with the legal findings of the most prominent, prestigious international institution, the International Court of Justice. We are debating whether or not we should comply with international law. As much as this ICJ advisory is important and timely, but we should not at all neglect the fact that the occupation of the Palestinian territories has been and will remain unlawful. And none of you ever needed to wait all these decades for such advisory opinion to know that. But here we are. And the real test begins now. The real test today is for those countries who preach and call others to respect international law and rule of law. So what will your position be now? The real test today is for those countries who preach and call others to stick to principles, respect the UN Charter, and to comply with the decisions of its organs and bodies. So what will your position be now? The real test today is for those countries who watched the ongoing massacres and the genocide in Gaza for almost a year and witnessed the systematic destruction and dehumanization conducted by an apartheid regime for decades. So what will your position be now? On which side of history are you going to be on? What will the books of history say about you? What are you going to tell your people if you happen to vote against this resolution or even abstain? What excuse are you going to use to justify such decision? If you can't vote for peace and justice and against occupation and illegal settlements, how you'll be able to ask for support if one day you're occupied? How will you explain if your government supports in any way such occupation in violation of international law and not hold those who do so accountable? And what will you say to those who will aim at you and say, "Welcome to the world of double standards"? And talking about double standards, just a while ago, we heard the representative of the occupying Israeli forces bashing you all, as he does with his predecessors, perform a show and teaching us and lecturing us about humanity and morality, totally disconnected from reality. Even today, he couldn't bring any justification, nor speak about the topic we're discussing, the illegal settlements. He could not address the resolution and trying to show that the world started only on October the 7th, neglecting the fact of history. Well, if he considers this assembly a circus, guess what? I consider him a clown performing in this place, always bringing his preps, trying to produce a show, failing to make us laugh, deceiving us from reality. That's what they try to do, but they failed dramatically. So when I ask him if he thinks this place is a circus, why are you performing in it? Why are you still a member in it? Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for you to show action and not words. Nearly a year will pass and the massacres and genocide in Gaza and the West Bank is continuing. The inability of the international community, especially the Security Council, to stop these atrocities and reach a ceasefire, and the silence of many of you, is what allowed the killing of tens of thousands, injuring hundreds of thousands, the displacement of almost 2 million, the spread of famine and diseases. So today, do some justice for those innocent and vote in favor of this resolution, which would be a message from the world to the occupying forces and who support them blindly. Say enough is enough, and it's time to act. Libya reaffirms its position that it won't define resistance against occupation as terrorism, and who from your countries didn't gain their independence without resistance, especially when the doors of peaceful solutions are completely shut down. Libya affirms its position that the only peaceful solution to this 7 decades of aggression and occupation is by recognizing the Palestinians' right to defend themselves and resist occupation and the right of self-determination, and having an independent state with Jerusalem, its capital. In conclusion, it's time now for all to comply and respect the outcome of the ICJ. This court, which we all know has established or was established to help in ensuring peace and justice, where international law should prevail over the use of force. Therefore, we call on you all to vote in favor of this resolution to pave the road for peace. History will remember those countries which have taken a principle, a moral, a legal or humane stance, and it will also remember those who had their humanity in deep coma and were aware and deliberately participated in this live broadcasted atrocity, especially the 21st century Holocaust, the Holocaust of Gaza. Voting in favor of this resolution today is a vote for peace, and it's a vote for justice. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Libya. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
السيد الرئيس بداية أتقدم منكم بالتهنئة على انتخابكم رئيسا للجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة بدورتها 79 وأشكركم على استجابتكم لطلب استئناف الجلسة الاستثنائية الطارئة العاشرة للجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة متحدون من أجل السلام، ويعرب الأردن عن دعمه لبيانات المجموعة العربية ومنظمة التعاون الإسلامي وحركة عدم الانحياز. السيد الرئيس، يأتي انعقاد جلستنا اليوم للنظر في مشروع القرار الذي قدمه الوفد الفلسطيني الشقيق في ضوء الرأي الاستشاري لمحكمة العدل الدولية والذي صدر في تموز الفائت بشأن التبعات القانونية الناشئة عن سياسات وممارسات إسرائيل في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة بما في ذلك القدس الشرقية، وذلك استجابة لطلب الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة أواخر العام 2022. ويعرب الأردن عن دعمه الكامل للمشروع الفلسطيني، وندعو الدول الأعضاء للتصويت لصالحه. السيد الرئيس، يعتبر الأردن الرأي الاستشاري الصادر عن المحكمة مفصلا تاريخيا في القضية الفلسطينية، حيث أكد ما كنا جميعا ندركه منذ عقود، وهو أن الاحتلال الإسرائيلي غير قانوني، وأن وجود مستوطناتها ومستوطنيها في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة غير شرعي وباطل، وأن ممارساتها بحق الشعب الفلسطيني الرازح تحت الاحتلال هي ممارسات عنصرية في المقام الأول ترتقي للتمييز العنصري والأبارتايد. سيد الرئيس، إن إنفاذ ما ورد في الرأي الاستشاري للمحكمة هو واجب علينا كدول ومنظمات دولية ومجتمع دولي، لأن ما أعلنته المحكمة في هذا الرأي يعكس موقف القانون الدولي من القضية الفلسطينية والاحتلال الإسرائيلي وحق تقرير المصير الفلسطيني، ومن الخروقات الإسرائيلية الجسيمة للقواعد الآمرة في القانون الدولي. وسنشهد في المستقبل القريب كيف سينعكس مضمون الرأي الاستشاري على الإجراءات القضائية التي سيتم اتخاذها في المحاكم الوطنية والإقليمية والدولية ضد الاحتلال والممارسات الإسرائيلية. وتماشيا مع الرأي الاستشاري والمرافعة التي قدمها الأردن أمام المحكمة، لا يسعنا إلا أن نجدد تأكيدنا على أن السياسات الإسرائيلية في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة قد سعت إلى إجهاض حق الشعب الفلسطيني في تحقيق مصيره، وهو ما لا يمكن للمجتمع الدولي أن يسمح به. ونشدد هنا على ضرورة إلزام إسرائيل بتطبيق ما تضمنه الرأي الاستشاري بهذا الخصوص، بما في ذلك إنهاء الاحتلال الإسرائيلي المستمر منذ حزيران 1967 بأسرع وقت ممكن، والوقف الفوري لجميع الأنشطة الاستيطانية وإجلاء المستوطنين في الأرض الفلسطينية من الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة، ووقف إجراءاتها التعسفية والقمعية تجاه الشعب الفلسطيني في أرضه المحتلة. سيد الرئيس، نجدد دعمنا المطلق لرأي المحكمة الذي ألزم إسرائيل أيضا بإعادة الممتلكات لأصحابها الشرعيين، وأيضا تقديم التعويضات للمتضررين من سياسات إسرائيل وممارساتها في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة. وندعم الإجراءات التي أدرجها مشروع القرار الفلسطيني من وقف استيراد وشراء المنتجات المصنعة في المستوطنات أو توريد السلاح إلى إسرائيل أو استيراده منها، فضلا عن تأكيد مشروع القرار لأهمية اتخاذ كافة الإجراءات لوقف الانتهاكات الهادفة إلى تغيير الوضع التاريخي القائم للأماكن المقدسة في القدس. إن عدم تقديم الدعم لإسرائيل للاستمرار بجرائمها وخروقاتها بحق الشعب الفلسطيني ليس ترفا فكريا، وإنما واجب قانوني على كل دولة وعلى المجتمع الدولي ككل تنفيذه. من يدعم المستوطنات عليه أن يتوقف. من تقوم شركاته بتغذية آلة القتل والعنف الإسرائيلي ضد الشعب الفلسطيني عليه أن يجبرها على التوقف عن ذلك، وأن يؤيد إجراءات إسرائيل لخلق واقع جديد على الأرض ضد فلسطين عليه أن يعي أن ذلك مصيره الفشل لا محالة. سيد الرئيس، في ضوء تأكيد الرأي الاستشاري للمحكمة على وحدة الأرض الفلسطينية وحق الفلسطينيين بالعودة ورفضه للتهجير القسري، علينا جميعا العمل على إنفاذ ذلك بجميع الوسائل القانونية الممكنة من خلال إصدار التشريعات الوطنية اللازمة والإجراءات الفردية والجماعية الواجبة لتحقيق هذه الغاية. كما لا بد لنا أن نكثف الجهود الدولية الرامية للضغط على إسرائيل لوقف جرائمها البشعة بحق الشعب الفلسطيني في غزة، والتي راح ضحيتها عشرات الآلاف من المدنيين الفلسطينيين منذ اندلاع حرب إسرائيل البربرية والإرهابية منذ ما يقرب عن عام. وأؤكد هنا على ضرورة ضغط مجلس الأمن والمجتمع الدولي على إسرائيل لضمان وقف الحرب بشكل فوري وإدخال المساعدات الإنسانية إلى القطاع بشكل كاف ومستدام والكف عن استهداف عمال الإغاثة والطواقم الأموية وتطبيق قرارات مجلس الأمن ذات العلاقة وآخرها القرار 2735. كما نطالب المجتمع الدولي ببلورة موقف موحد يدين استمرار الإجراءات الإبادية الإسرائيلية وخروقاتها للوضع التاريخي القائم في القدس وأن يلزم إسرائيل وحكومتها المتطرفة على وقف انتهاكاتها في الضفة الغربية وسياساتها الرامية إلى جر المنطقة إلى حرب إقليمية شاملة لا يحمد عقباها. في الختام السيد الرئيس نجدد الدعم الأردني التاريخي والمطلق لحق الفلسطينيين في تقرير مصيرهم وإقامة دولتهم المستقلة ذات السيادة على خطوط الرابع من حزيران لعام 1967 وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية المحتلة وفقا للقرارات الأممية ذات الصلة وعلى أساس حل الدولتين سبيلا وحيدا لتحقيق السلام الشامل. ونؤكد على ضرورة احترام إسرائيل للوضع التاريخي القائم في القدس ومقدساتها الإسلامية والمسيحية في إطار الوصاية الهاشمية التاريخية عليها. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jordan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, we gather today to discuss the question of Palestine, a stark reminder of the importance of multilateral action, but at the same time, a proof of the limits of its frameworks, including these very United Nations. On the one hand, without the international law, without the global fora of nations, the Palestinian cause would have faded into oblivion in a world dominated by narrow interests. On the other hand, multilateral action has shown its limitation, despite the consensus of the international community and the successive binding resolution that plainly affirm and reaffirm the Palestinian rights to self-determination, Palestinian right to their land, Palestinian right to their statehood. Yes, we find ourselves unable to enforce them. This failure stems from an occupying power that disregards international law and thrives on impunity, acting as though it is above the law. In Gaza, in the West Bank, the Israeli occupier continue to kill, continue to arrest, with the toll of victims surpassing in nearly 1 year 41,000 martyrs, almost 100,000 wounded, and more than 10,000 Palestinian detainees. The Israeli occupying power desecrates holy sites of Al-Quds Sharif and forcibly displace its people. Just this morning, we witnessed another assault from Israeli settlers protected by the Israeli police into the mosque of Al-Aqsa. the occupying power openly denies the right of the Palestinian people and seeks to undermine the establishment of their states. Mr. President, in light of this bleak reality, which threatens to extinguish hope in the heart of the Palestinians and peace lovers around the world. The advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice came. This historic and comprehensive decision by the highest judicial body in the world challenges the Israeli occupation narrative and exposes its apartheid policies. It reaffirms the illegality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories and the need to its end. Now, as President Abdelmajid Tebboune has emphasized, and I quote, "We, the advocates of the just peace, bear the responsibility to end the historic injustice inflicted on the Palestinian people, an outcome achievable only by compelling the occupying power to comply with international law." End of quote. Mr. President, the voice of justice has spoken, and it is imperative that we shall all abide by its ruling. Failing to do so will disrupt the very foundations of the international order. We should ensure the full implementation of the ICJ advisory opinion. For this purpose, the State of Palestine submitted to the General Assembly this historic draft resolution. And this draft is historic in its significance, as it is the first resolution submitted by the State of Palestine in its national capacity in the history of the United Nations. It is another victory on the path to full membership to the United Nations. It is also historic in its content, as it outlines a roadmap to end the occupation and enable the Palestinian people to fully enjoy their rights. My country, Algeria, having always stood by Palestine, promptly sponsored this draft resolution and called on all members to support it, to vote in favor of it. Today, we must be united in our support, in our solidarity with the Palestinian people. We must stand together in defense of international law. We must stand united for peace. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Algeria, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Mr. President, the United States has worked with determination to support a comprehensive peace agreement that would permanently resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is no other path that both guarantees Israel's security and future as a democratic Jewish state and ensures Palestinians can live in peace and dignity in a state of their own. Consistent with this position, we have long opposed unilateral measures that undermine the prospect of a two-state solution. That includes the advancement of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and it includes the resolution that the Palestinian delegation has put before us today. For the better part of 4 decades, the United States has been clear about our policy concerns with Israel's program of settlements. Earlier this year, we also expressed the view that the program of settlements is inconsistent with international law. We maintain firm opposition to settlement expansion, which in our judgment only weakens Israel's security. The United States also respects the important role of the International Court of Justice in advising the UN General Assembly and in helping peacefully settle disputes. However, adoption of a one-sided resolution that selectively interprets the substance of the ICJ's opinion does not advance what we all want to see, and that is progress toward two states living in peace, side by side. This proposed resolution advances the flawed and indeed false idea that adopting a text here in New York can somehow resolve what is easily one of the most complex and persistent diplomatic challenges of our time. Colleagues, we all know that is not true. We all know, as the Security Council has repeatedly underscored, that a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict must be achieved through negotiations between the two parties. Negotiations grounded in some basic principles, including the notion of land for peace. Regrettably, but very significantly, the Palestinian resolution makes no mention of this reality. It also fails to acknowledge, among other things, that Hamas, a terrorist organization, is currently exerting power, control, and influence in Gaza. And it refuses to address the reality that Israel, a United Nations member state, simply has a right to protect and defend its people from acts of terror or violence. I understand the last few months have been devastating for the Palestinian people. Families have endured hell in Gaza and the West Bank due to the new round of fighting Hamas set in motion on October 7th. But the resolution put forward by the Palestinian delegation does nothing to end the current conflict with Hamas in Gaza, nothing to bring the hostages home to their families, and nothing to surge life-saving assistance to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. It does not offer a concrete path forward for how, consistent with Security Council Resolution 2735, the Palestinian Authority in Gaza intends to reunify the Gaza Strip with the West Bank. It does not address calls for reform of the Palestinian Authority, not only from the international community, including numerous Arab states, but also from the Palestinian people. And despite the fact that Hamas just upended ceasefire negotiations by brutally murdering 6 hostages, and despite the fact that Hamas continues to use Palestinian civilians as human shields in Gaza, this resolution does not include any measures to pressure Hamas to heed Security Council Resolution 2735, accept the deal on the table, and implement it without delay or further conditions. Colleagues, using inflammatory language in this text is not going to advance the cause of peace. Demanding every member state impose economic sanctions on Israel and its officials is not going to reinvigorate the peace process, let alone create a path toward a two-state solution. Creating more special committees and convening a conference ostensibly for no other purpose than to pressure Israel is not a viable substitute for the one thing we all know, and that is the Security Council and General Assembly have long agreed is necessary to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that is direct negotiations. Rather, and much like other symbolic gestures pursued by the Palestinian delegation in recent months, many of which do little or nothing to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza, this resolution is a stark reminder that there are no shortcuts to peace. Colleagues, in the dark months since October 7th, I've heard and sensed a feeling of hopelessness regarding the prospects for peace, not only between Israeli and Palestinians, but more broadly in the region. But we must not be guided by fear and despair. We know what needs to be done to achieve peace, starting with an immediate ceasefire with hostage release based on the principles of Security Council Resolution 2735. The United States will continue to do everything possible to put forward ideas and proposals to achieve a deal that would help lay the foundation for a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. But there is no path forward or hope offered through this resolution today. Its adoption will not save Palestinian lives, bring the hostages home, end Israeli settlements, or reinvigorate the peace process. For that reason, I urge you to vote no and to instead join the United States in pressing both parties, Israelis and Palestinians, to recommit to the hard work of direct negotiations and to press Hamas to take the deal on the table. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيد الرئيس، السيدات والسادة، ينضم وفد بلادي إلى البيانات التي ألقتها الجمهورية العربية السورية باسم المجموعة العربية والكاميرون باسم منظمة التعاون الإسلامي وأوغندا باسم مجموعة دول حركة عدم الانحياز. بداية أود أن أهنئ رئيس الجمعية العامة ونوابه للدورة 79 متمنيا لهم التوفيق والنجاح، كما نشكرهم على استئناف الدورة الاستثنائية الطارئة 10 للجمعية العامة بمتابعة فتوى محكمة العدل الدولية بشأن الآثار القانونية الناشئة عن سياسات إسرائيل وممارساتها في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة بما فيها القدس الشرقية، وعن عدم شرعية استمرار وجود إسرائيل في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة، حيث أفتت محكمة العدل الدولية في تاريخ 19 من شهر أبريل الماضي بأن استمرار وجود إسرائيل في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة غير قانوني، يجب إنهاؤه ويجب معالجة ما نشأ عنه من أنشطة استيطانية. كما رأت المحكمة أن إسرائيل ملزمة بالتعويض عن الأضرار الناتجة، وأن المنظمات الدولية بما فيها الأمم المتحدة ملزمة بعدم الاعتراف بشرعية الوضع الناشئ عن هذا الوجود غير القانوني، حيث جاءت الفتوى بناء على طلب الجمعية العامة بقرارها رقم 77 تقسيم 247 بتاريخ 30 ديسمبر من عام 2022. السيد الرئيس، لقد رحبت بلادي بالرأي الاستشاري الصادر عن محكمة العدل الدولية بشأن سياسات وممارسات إسرائيل وتأكيدها على عدم قانونية الوجود الإسرائيلي على الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة. السيد الرئيس، السيدات والسادة، إن حفظ السلم والأمن الدوليين يأتي في مقدمة مهام هذه المنظمة، واليوم يظهر لنا جليا تأخر المنظمة تارة وعجزها تارة أخرى was either late or was unable to carry out this role.
حيث أن تأخرها في التوصل لحل عادل وشامل للقضية الفلسطينية سبب مأساة إنسانية على مدى عقود مضت وأفضى للتداعيات المأساوية التي نشهدها اليوم، حيث تمارس إسرائيل القوة القائمة بالاحتلال جميع أشكال الجرائم بحق الشعب الفلسطيني غير آبهة بقرارات الشرعية الدولية والقانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني، حتى تولدت لديها القناعة بأنها فوق تلك القرارات والقوانين، وأنها تمتلك حصانة تحميها من المساءلة والمحاسبة، مما دفعها للتمادي بسياساتها العدوانية الوحشية والإمعان بكافة أنواع الجرائم والإجراءات التي تهدف لطمس الحق الفلسطيني. السيد الرئيس، لقد جاءت فتوى محكمة العدل الدولية متسقة مع ما يؤمن به المجتمع الدولي تجاه الحق الفلسطيني، ومؤكدة على أن الممارسات الإسرائيلية غير القانونية الممتدة عبر عقود من الزمن أدت ولا زالت تؤدي إلى تفاقم الانتهاكات بحق الشعب الفلسطيني، وعليه نتطلع جميعا لمتابعة فورية في ضوء هذه الفتوى لمعالجة هذا الظلم التاريخي الذي طال أمده. إن المجتمع الدولي ممثلا في الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة مطالب بأن يقر بضرورة احترام هذا الرأي، بل ومطالب أيضا بأن يراقب تنفيذ ما تضمنه من التزامات على الجانب الإسرائيلي، حيث أن التفعيل الحقيقي الذي ننشده جميعا ونصبو إليه لدور الأمم المتحدة لا بد أن يبدأ باحترام قراراتها وتعزيز دور أجهزتها. وختاما، السيد الرئيس، تتطلع المملكة العربية السعودية إلى اعتماد مشروع القرار المقدم اليوم، وتدعو الدول الأعضاء المحبة للسلام للتصويت لصالحه، كونه يعيد التأكيد على احترام المجتمع الدولي لرأي محكمة العدل الدولية، ويهدف إلى تأكيد الحق الفلسطيني المنهوب، ويؤسس لمرحلة تفضي إلى السلام. كما تؤكد المملكة العربية السعودية على ضرورة القيام بخطوات عملية وذات مصداقية للوصول إلى حل عادل وشامل للقضية الفلسطينية وفقا لمبادرة السلام العربية وقرارات الشرعية الدولية، بما يكفل للشعب الفلسطيني الشقيق حقه الأصيل في تقرير مصيره وإقامة دولته المستقلة على حدود 1967 وعاصمته القدس الشرقية. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway.
Mr. President, the advisory opinion of 19 July by the International Court of Justice is a highly important ruling from the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. The court's message could hardly have been any clearer. Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory constitutes a wrongful act of a continuing character. This has been brought about by Israel's violations of the prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force and the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. Consequently, the court states that Israel has an obligation to bring an end to this unlawful presence as rapidly as possible. The court also reaffirms that Israel's settlement activity violates international law and furthermore concludes that Israel must immediately stop all new settlement activity, evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory, repeal all legislation and measures creating or maintaining the unlawful situation, and provide full compensation to all affected Palestinians. This is an unequivocal message which Israel must comply with without delay. The court further emphasizes that all other states are required to not assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation created by Israel. It urges the UN General Assembly and the Security Council to consider measures to help put an end to the illegal presence. This places a responsibility on all of us. A resolution building on ICJ's advisory opinion will be put to a vote. It is aligned with the court's opinion and aims at ensuring that the latter is upheld. Norway will therefore vote in favor. And we encourage everyone to do the same. Respect for international law is a prerequisite for maintaining global peace and security. Mr. President, turning to the dramatic situation on the ground, Norway continues to call for an immediate ceasefire and the release of all remaining hostages who remain in captivity after Hamas's terror attack on 7 October, which we have condemned in the strongest possible terms. After more than 11 months of war, the situation in Gaza is catastrophic. The scale of destruction, the massive number of casualties, and the extreme humanitarian needs are unprecedented. The living hell that the civilians in Gaza are going through every single day is happening on our watch. No one can claim that we do not understand the extent of the ongoing violence and destruction. Still, we have been unable to prevent it. That is unforgivable. In the occupied West Bank, the rapidly deteriorating situation is highly dangerous and could have serious implications for a region already on the brink of a full-scale war. The dire economic situation, recent large-scale Israeli military operations, and unabated settler violence continue to inflict severe harm on the local Palestinian population, and all contribute to the escalation of an already tense situation. Mr. President, the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination, as reaffirmed by the court in its advisory opinion. According to the court, Israel, as the occupying power, has an obligation not to impede the Palestinian people from exercising this right to self-determination. This includes the right to an independent and sovereign state over the entirety of the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel's continued occupation and unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is not compatible with the realization of a strong Palestinian state and ultimately a two-state solution. There is no way to provide lasting security for both Palestinians and Israelis without the establishment of a Palestinian state. A two-state solution requires an Israeli and a Palestinian state. Norway's recent recognition of the State of Palestine reaffirms Norway's long-standing commitment to the two-state solution through the establishment of a sovereign, democratic, contiguous, and viable state of Palestine, living side by side with the State of Israel in peace and within secure and recognized borders. Through this recognition, Norway affirms its support for the Palestinian leadership, who is committed to the two-state solution, to diplomacy, and abstention from violence in its efforts to achieve peace. Norway is of the view that the great majority of all states supports the realization of the two-state solution. Let us therefore also commit to taking concrete and irreversible steps towards this end. It is more urgent than ever. Mr. President, the current trajectory is not sustainable. A change of course is urgently needed. The court has provided a framework to remedy the situation. It deserves all our attention, and I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Norway. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall. This meeting is adjourned.
you.